Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Leanne's Lair. I am Leanne Moonraven, and I'm back in the audio seat after a couple of years of hiatus. But because we're all pretty much in isolation and lockdown, we're finding ways to reinvent ourselves. And so I decided to come out of retirement and introduce Real Talk with Real People, which is my tagline once again. My first guest is Dr. Guy McPherson, and I'm so glad to have him with me today. I don't even remember how I met Guy. I just think I started following him on Instagram, and he has an amazing blog, and he talks about climate change. And I'm going to read his bio because he is definitely worthy of the recognition. And I'm so glad that he's here with me today. So, Dr. Guy McPherson is an internationally recognized speaker, award winning scientist, and the world's leading authority on the topic of abrupt climate change leading to near term human extinction. He is professor emeritus at the University of Arizona. His published works include more than a dozen books and hundreds of scholarly articles, which have for many years focused on conservation of biological diversity. Dr. McPherson has appeared on television, radio, and several documentary films. Guy taught and conducted research for more than 20 award-winning years at Texas A&M University, University of Arizona, University of California, Berkeley, Southern Utah University, and Grinnell College. He is currently Professor Emeritus of Conservation Biology at the University of Arizona. Welcome, Dr. Fairson. Can I call you Guy?
Yes, please do. I insisted my students do that in every class I taught.
Okay, that's great. Guy, thank you for being here. And like I said, I'm not really sure how I met you. I just found you on Instagram and I found your posts. You combined science with humor. And some of the things were pretty funny that you posted. And I started following you. You follow me back. And it's been, I think, a couple of years now. And when I did my New Year pop in, to just, spontaneously calling people on my friends list that I had never spoken before, you were kind enough to take my call, and that's when we met in person. So thank you for being my baptism by fire and my
Well,
first guest.
I saw you do that. I saw on social media that you said, I'm just calling people at random. And so I hit like because I thought that was very clever and brave. And we spend so much of our time avoiding people or, we have these weird responses. So I want to encourage that kind of unusual behavior.
Yeah. Well, Jen doesn't hurt either. It was New Year's Eve. So, all right, well, let's get to it. Let's talk about this topic of climate change. And I know that we initially started talking about global warming, and now we don't use that term so much anymore. It's shifted to climate change. So can you walk us through that and why the terminology has changed?
Yeah, up until the 1970s, pretty much all scientists referred to the concept of global warming. And that became a little confusing because as the globe warms, as the overall temperature of the planet increases, the temperature actually decreases in some places. And whereas the long time expression has been a warmer planet is a wetter planet, because there's more evaporation, therefore more moisture in the atmosphere, therefore more moisture falling out of the atmosphere. So a warmer planet is a wetter planet. But at the same time, there are places that are getting drier with the increase in global average temperature. So I think climate change better refers to what's going on, although it is marked by overall planetary warming. The global average temperature of the planet is about 2 degrees above the 1750 baseline. And that's a big number.
Right. And so is it still the greenhouse effect that is causing this warming?
Yes, it is. And there are many greenhouses. There are at least 43 known greenhouses. Most of us are familiar with carbon dioxide. Methane is another one that gets a lot of attention. What doesn't get a lot of attention is the most abundant by volume greenhouse gas, and that's water vapor. And and the interaction between water vapor in the atmosphere and planetary warming is really tightly coupled. So the sun beats down onto the planet, which is mostly ocean, mostly water. Some of that water evaporates. Then H2O in the atmosphere serves as a warming agent. And so that coupling proceeds fairly quickly over time.
So, as it's warming, what's happening up there? What's it causing? What damage is it doing?
Yeah, the rate of change is what is extremely critical to understand. And as a conservation biologist, I've been studying the rate of change for a long time. It's not so much from our human perspective, 2 degrees Celsius, about 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit. That's no big deal, right? We go in and out of rooms and the temperature changes by 2 degrees Celsius
Mm-hmm.
pretty much every day.
Right.
But what's important is the other organisms, especially plants and microbes, fungi, bacteria, that have evolved in a particular place that is characterized by a certain seasonality, global average or average temperature for that location, variation in temperature for that location, and so forth. And so, and you can imagine that a plant that arrives in a place and succeeds there does so because all of the habitat requirements are met. Everything that plant needs is right there at the ready. The nutrients that it can take up from the soils, the carbon dioxide that it takes up from the atmosphere, the appropriate amount of sunlight, and so on. So everything's working great.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if you change that physical environment by even a tiny bit, plants can't keep up. They can't pick up their roots and move along. This and regenerating by seed is a fairly slow process, especially for very long-lived plants. Giant sequoia, lives a couple thousand years. You can't change the environment where the giant sequoia is in a span of decades or even centuries because that plant is built for that environment
Mm-hmm.
in that it has been selected for a specific environment. So we depend so greatly upon these other organisms, and we are inadvertently changing the environment for the organisms, and that means that they're going to die. And we are clearly in the midst of a mass extinction event. They're already dying.
Okay, well, you almost answered my next question as to how severe is the threat. It sounds like it's pretty imminent.
It is extreme because we depend upon so many other organisms. And people respond to me with things like this, but we live in the International Space Station. Yes, we do, temporarily. We live in nuclear submarines. Yes, we do, temporarily. And how do we do that? By providing food and water and appropriate temperature for our body to handle in all those places. We wouldn't live on the International Space Station without the materials we take there from Earth. Likewise for the nuclear submarines. So, yes, we can persist in places that are truly amazing. McMurdo Station in Antarctica, humans live there for extended periods of time, but only because we're supplementing the food supply. So, that's important to keep in mind as we are here on this earth, and Homo sapiens, just like at least 7 previous species in the genus Homo, have adapted and evolved through natural selection for this particular sort of environment.
Mm-hmm.
And you change the environment too quickly, we're vertebrates, we're mammals, and we're outstripping the ability of vertebrates and mammals to keep up with the rate of change. So it would represent classic human hubris to assume that we can get along just fine with changes in the environment.
I spoke with one of your colleagues several years ago, and right when awareness was coming to climate change, and you and I have discussed this before. Why even 5, 6, 7 years since I spoke with him, people still don't believe that this is an issue. They don't believe that it's a problem. What is it in our psyche that is not allowing people to accept that this change? Is it because it still gets cold, because it still snows? What is the problem?
Relatively recently, there was a Congress member or senator, I don't remember which, on the floor of either the Congress or the Senate in the United States throwing snowballs and saying, look,
Yes.
global warming, it's a myth. We got snowballs.
Yeah. Fake
So
news,
that's the kind
right?
of response. And bear in mind that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 1969 book identified various stages of grief. And the first of those stages is denial.
Hmm.
So, of course, people believe what they want to believe. Most of us in the so called first world are enjoying enormous privilege, and we don't want this to go away. We don't even want to make sacrifices so that we can sustain habitat for humans, much less have the ability to deliver goods to the grocery store and have water coming through the tap. We don't want any of that to go away
Right.
because it's great. It's nice. I'm a huge fan myself.
Yeah. So, I mean, we see a lot of denial in people, and we'll probably revisit that a little bit more in the interview. But um, I don't
And
want to lose
let
that
me
thought.
let me just interrupt there for a minute, because one of the reasons we see so much denial is that there are public campaigns to promote that denial. There's as from the oil companies, there's as much effort, maybe more, as there was from the cigarette companies, from the tobacco companies back in the 60s and 70s, when they were just pouring money in to advertising in all kinds of ways to convince people that cigarettes were not harmful to your health. And the oil companies are doing the same today to convince us that greenhouse gases are the best thing going.
Well, and speaking of oil companies, that actually leads to my next question: is Greta Thunberg, who's now become the face of activism for climate change. The oil, I don't know if you saw that ad that the oil company, the very inappropriate ad of the oil company and their depiction of their relationship with her, but it was very graphic and it was sexual exploitation. And she's a young girl of 16 years old. Why do they hate her so much? Is it she because she is it? It's all about economics, right? She's threatening their bottom dollar. Is that what's going on here?
Absolutely. And she is the perfect person to deliver the message.
Mm-hmm.
Just like the Suzuki girl 27 years before her, who I think she was 12 or 13 when she delivered the message that was very similar. It's a young person, and people think that she's so young that she couldn't possibly be lying to us. She appears to be very genuine, if a little naive, when it comes to the whole picture. So of course we're all attracted to believing that kind of person. And so that's a real threat to the oil companies.
Mm-hmm.
The oil companies don't want somebody who is charismatic in any way to step forward and challenge the notion that we can keep going no matter what, and it's all going to be good for us.
Well, in addition to the oil companies, and I remember this from school. So if my memory's a little foggy, then just correct me. But the Earth gets a lot of its oxygen from the Amazon. Is that part correct?
Yes, in fact, climate scientists frequently refer to the Amazon and the coral reefs as
Yes.
the lifeblood of the planet for all practical purposes.
And they are completely destroying the Amazon forest in Brazil and Venezuela. And what's going to happen if that's continue? I mean, they're using it for development and building, and what's going to happen if the Amazon and we hear stories about the coral reef is dying. It's changing colors, it's dying. What's going to happen when that's gone?
Well, apparently, we're willing to sacrifice habitat for our own species and millions of others for a few dollars more. That's what's going on in the Amazon basin. And we reached a tipping point a long time ago with respect to how many trees we need to leave. Same with the coral reefs, as you correctly pointed out. In history, there have been three worldwide coral bleaching events. The
Wow.
first one was in 1978. So think about that for a minute. 1978. That was not that long ago.
Right.
That was the first one ever documented, and we've had two others since then. We're clearly in the midst of the third, and the Great Barrier Reef has been decimated.
Wow. Okay, so I saw that movie a few years ago, Day After Tomorrow. that that movie terrified me. Is that what's going to happen? How
Well,
accurate is that movie? I
Well,
love that movie, by the way.
not in 20 minutes.
Well, we
You know,
hope not.
and that's the way it's portrayed in the movie because
Yes.
it's Hollywood, right? And
Yes.
so they have to go for effect. So, and and what was being displayed there was the reversal of the AMOC, the Atlantic Meridional Oscillation, and so I don't remember the last one. In any event, so that's sometimes called the Gulf Stream, that carries saltwater, warm saltwater in the Atlantic up all the way to the southern end of Greenland, and therefore provides warming in most of Western Europe and even in Eastern North America. And what was depicted in that movie was the reversal, essentially overnight, of this circulation system. And
Wow.
therefore, the world became very, very cold.
Oh, okay. All
And
right.
so that's why there was this catastrophic sudden ice age that befell all the movie stars, right? And
You're making me laugh, but yeah, I love that movie because it was just so catastrophic. But
it's interesting. I didn't watch the movie, but I wrote an op-ed piece about it that
did
was in the
you should
local
watch it,
newspaper.
guy. You should really watch it. It's pretty good. So I read. I mean, there's only so much news you can absorb, but I did read a couple of months ago where one of the Arctic shelves melted and a complete species of penguins was gone, just like that, because their hatchlings were on the shelf, and when it fell, they just, they perished.
Right.
We continue, and I particularly love polar bears. That is like my spirit animal, who I would imagine at this point is very closely approaching extinction or endangerment, at least. What's going to happen when these species start disappearing?
Well, they already are. In August of 2010, so nearly 10 years ago, the United Nations Environment Program released a report indicating that an estimated 150 to 200 species were going extinct every day.
Oh my gosh, every
Every
day.
day. That was
Wow.
10 years ago.
Wow.
And as we know, the United Nations is a conservative body. They don't
Mm-hmm.
put out those kinds of numbers unless they are supported by evidence.
Mm-hmm.
And sure enough, somebody who I interviewed on my radio show, Nature Bats Last, a couple or 3 years ago, I can't remember the person or the episode, he had actually gone in and counted, and it was more than 200 a day, which is what we would have expected. This is a couple of years ago. And of course, that's what we would expect because it's much later. It's 7 years down the road from that original estimation. And that original estimate was undoubtedly very conservative, as all governmental bodies tend to be, whether it's at the international level, as with the United Nations, or at the national level. The people proceed with what's called reticence, scientific reticence. And James Hansen used that term to refer to scientists and how they generally underplay their findings in the public sphere.
Wow. Okay.
So,
So,
in other words, as my radio show co host and dear friend Kevin Hester says almost every time I visit with him, it can only be worse than we know.
wow.
It can't be better than we know.
Well, I
It can
think we're
only be
living
worse.
that today, aren't we? I think
Right,
we're
absolutely.
absolutely. We're
Because
going to
of the
talk about that
tendency
in a
to under,
minute.
yeah, the tendency to understate, the,
Yeah.
the the willingness to be conservative instead of adhering to the precautionary principle.
And
That's the
is that to prevent panic, or is it hiding the facts from people? I mean, that's a fine line, I think.
it is a fine line, and scientists tend to be very conservative because nobody wants to make a prediction and have it be wrong.
Yeah.
And so they downplay the impact, they downplay the implications of what's going on right now.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes sense because all of science is conservative and has been conservative for a long time. And academic scientists are among the most conservative. And those are mostly the people who get the attention of the press.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't get much reward in academia or in science generally for sticking your neck out. as with almost any other part of this society, of this culture,
Right.
right? The nail that sticks up gets pounded down.
Yeah.
And that's true throughout the scientific arena.
Okay, well, a minute ago, I mentioned the ice shelf and it falling. So let's talk about that, and also what I read a couple of weeks ago about 28 medieval viruses that have surfaced because of the ice caps melting. Tell me about that, guy. That's kind of scary.
Yeah, the Greenland ice shelf and maybe Antarctica. I come across so many articles, and it's hard to remember the details unless I have it right in front of me.
Mm-hmm.
That said, there is an essay that I update frequently at guymcpherson.com. It appears on the homepage and on the front page, no matter where you are. It's called Extinction Foretold, Extinction Ignored. And so you can find everything I'm going to talk about today there. You can
Okay.
find the scientific source. It depends almost completely upon the peer-reviewed literature. So it's obviously fairly conservative. The rate of melt of Greenland and maybe Antarctica, I'm pretty sure it's Antarctica too, has been 6 times greater than it was in the 1990s.
Wow.
Is now 6 times greater than it was in the 1990s, and that's not very long ago. So we have these massive events in which entire shelves slump off. And this is really important in both Greenland and Antarctica because this is land ice. It's not like the Arctic, which is floating ice.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's like an ice cube in a glass of water. And when it melts, it doesn't raise the level of water in the glass.
Right.
But Antarctica and Greenland, we're talking about glaciers, we're talking about terrestrial ice. And so when it falls into the ocean, melts quickly thereafter, it does raise the sea level.
Okay.
So this is very important, although I suspect we'll lose habitat for our species before we have a really significant rise in global average sea level. And I say that because it's already underway. There's a lot of climate refugees in Central America who are trying to get into the United States, not because they want to take their family to Disneyland, but because they can no longer grow food in Central America. It's a completely different world there than when I was living there between July of 2016 and October of 2018. The change has been very rapid.
So just from that time, it's changed significantly. So we're talking 4 years max.
Yeah. Yes.
Wow.
And here's how fast. I was talking with one of the people I interacted with on a pretty regular basis. He was 35 years old. He had moved to the area when he was 25. And this is in Western Belize in the Cayo district. So he moved there when he was 10 years old. And he said his dad always told him that the rainy season here was 10 months. 10 months out of the year, it rained. It was the rainy season. And that's what distinguishes tropical and subtropical areas from temperate regions is the length of the rainy and dry season as opposed to the hot or cold,
Mm-hmm.
right? So
Okay.
you would be reluctant to call any place in Belize winter because it's warm year
Exactly.
round.
I spent time in Cartagena, in Colombia.
Uh-huh.
So it's the same
Right.
thing. Their winter is their rainy season.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so 25 years previously to when I was talking with this individual, which was in 2018, there was a 10-month rainy season every year. When I got there with my partner, it was 6 and 6.
Wow.
And that was in 2016.
Right.
When we left in 2018, it was 2 and 10. It was a 2-month rainy season and a 10-month dry season, a complete reversal of what it had been 25 years earlier.
Well, then, so obviously that would affect agriculture. Obviously.
Oh, yes. And the people who are growing food there know it because it has immediate impacts. If your whole life, say you're that person I was talking to, you're 35 years old, your whole life you've been growing a certain part of your food,
Right.
as almost everybody there does.
Right.
And then over time, the same seeds, the same crops you've been using for years, they fail.
Wow.
Suddenly they're failing every year.
Wow.
It's devastating. It's
Yes.
catastrophic.
I can
It's
see
happening
that.
right now.
So in another 2 years or 4 years, maybe they won't have a rainy season at all if it's going
That
that
could,
quickly.
right, absolutely. They could be in the midst of a drought that lasts for an entire human generation.
Oh my gosh. Well, that really puts things into perspective. And if people can't understand that, it's because they don't want to.
Right.
Um,
Right. And we also see climate refugees other places around the world too. It's not just there, it's the islands in the South Pacific
mhm.
where sea level rise has caused an encroachment of brackish water into the fresh water that they pump out of the ground. So now you can't drink it anymore. In addition, lethal wet bulb temperatures are starting to be a significant affliction throughout India and those islands in the South Pacific and much of Central America. So there's a lot of different factors coming into play here, but all of them lead to the inability of humans to survive, whether it's by food, they can't get enough food, they can't get enough water, or the body just shuts down because of organ failure during when you
Yes.
experience lethal wet bulb temperatures.
Hmm. And dehydration.
Oh, yeah.
So, Guy, has this happened before? Does science indicate that this has ever happened before?
Oh, yes. Yes, the Mayan civilization in Belize, Guatemala, and Mexico once supported a couple of million people. No, about 10 million people. This from
Yes.
the peer-reviewed literature, maybe 2.5 years ago. And 10 million people were walking around with temples and pavement and growing a bunch of food, and it was a very complex civilization. And then there was a dry season, an extended dry season, much like the one we're seeing there now. And the Mayan civilization collapsed in a very short period of time.
Yeah.
And the
Millions of
Mayans,
people.
there are a few Mayans that still persist,
Hmm.
but as a civilization, there's no such thing as Mayan civilization anymore.
Hmm. Hmm. So when we hear about lost cities of Atlantis, and is it the rise of the ocean that the same pattern or indications that we're seeing now?
Yes, absolutely. So these things that we tended to treat as myths, many of them undoubtedly have roots in reality.
Wow. And that's true with urban legends, isn't it? They're usually
Sure.
based on something that really happened, and then it grows from there.
Yeah, we're pretty creative, but we're not creative enough to make up all this really bizarre stuff that turns out to be rooted in reality.
Exactly. So I guess that kind of leads into the next question that I had about the biological disasters that are going to be related to climate change, and how will it evolve in us as humans? How will it affect us? Will it affect our offspring, or what about that?
The ongoing virus scare from COVID-19,
Yes.
the novel coronavirus, this is exactly the kind of thing we can expect and that people have been warning about for years.
So
I
there
wrote
is a
about,
correlation or a direct link between global warming or climate change and these viruses.
absolutely, the viruses and other lethal organisms and non-organisms that arrive. So as the ice age goes away, as the ice goes away, we had an ice age 10, 12, 15,000 years ago, depending upon where you want to say it ended and where its apex was. Maybe the apex was about 18,000 years ago. And so there's a lot more ice than there is now. Well, a bunch of that ice is melting, so it's raising sea levels now compared to then. And it's also exposing a tremendous number of viruses, bacteria, anthrax, for example, in bodies of organisms that were beneath ice for a long period of time. So there's all kinds of things that present an existential threat to our species as a result of the climate changing. And among these are the diseases that we're seeing in great abundance, the 28 new virus groups that you talked about. They're actually virus groups. So there's probably within them many individual species of virus.
Oh, great.
So
Wow.
again, it can only be worse than we know.
Yeah.
We just can't keep up with the rate of change at the level of the planet. It's proceeding too quickly.
And so that brings me to my next question then about this rate of change that you're talking about. What's this doomsday clock all about? What is that?
Yeah, so the International Atomic Scientists Group does an update typically every year indicating where we are with respect to an existential threat to our species. And so they've been warning us for how long has that thing been around?
It's been around
30?
since the 50s, right? Is it? Has it been the
Yeah,
50s?
I don't recall, but it's been decades in any event.
Uh huh.
And as of the latest change of the hands of the clock, they moved it forward to the closest it's ever been to midnight at 100 seconds. So for the first time ever, and this was a couple or 3 months ago, for the first time ever, they weren't using minutes anymore. They were stalled at 2 minutes, 2 to 3 minutes, went back and forth, which is really close to midnight.
Yeah,
And then
right.
they decided minutes doesn't cut it anymore. We're going to have to switch to seconds. So we went to 100 seconds, a little less than 2 minutes. And that's how dire the existential threats are. And only within the last few years, to my knowledge, have they been incorporating climate change into that assessment. It used to be when it first arose, it was all about the nuclear threat.
Yes.
It was about the Soviet Union and the Cold War, and
Yes.
things looking dire on that front.
Hmm.
Well, that's that's one of our concerns for sure, but I don't think it's our worst concern.
Wow. Okay. So we've talked a lot about doom, doom and destruction. So is it too late? Is it too late to reverse? And what will we need to do? Because what we've seen since coronavirus and COVID-19 have reared its ugly head, we've seen because of mandatory isolation and quarantine, we've seen the air literally clearing in front of our eyes on these maps from space. We see that the air in China over China is clearing, the air over Italy, the air over Spain, where the factories have been forced to shut down. Is there hope? Because once this virus is run its course and the factories start back up, is there enough window there for any recovery to be made?
It would surprise me. Consider these two sources. Donald Trump's director of national intelligence at the time, Dan Coates, took to Capitol Hill to warn of abrupt climate change in February 2018. So just about 2 years ago, the director of intelligence went to Capitol Hill and warned of abrupt climate change, says, we're in it. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, said that climate change is irreversible in September 2019. They said because of the heating of the ocean.
Hmm.
So when you add those two little snippets together, abrupt and irreversible, it sounds a lot like abrupt and irreversible.
Yeah. So what's going to happen? We're going to continue to see these supermassive tornadoes and hurricanes and earthquakes, and is that going to become our normal?
Yes, I would say so, and worse. I think James Hansen's book, Storms of My Grandchildren, 2007, provides an accurate series of predictions, and we're already there. There's already talk of adding another level to hurricanes so that Category 5 is no longer representing the magnitude of the hurricane. So we might have to go to a Cat 6 hurricane, for example. So things
Wow.
are going to get worse, and then they're going to get worse, I'm afraid. And that's because we can either keep heating the planet through industrial activity, which, according to a peer-reviewed article in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences published December 26, 2018, by Burke and colleagues, if we maintain our present course, according to that paper, using the very conservative IPCC's representative concentration pathways, we're headed for Pliocene-style climate on Earth as early as 2030. Pliocene is 2 to 3 degrees Celsius warmer than we are right now. And at that rate of change, I don't see humans or very many other organisms surviving.
Hmm.
So it sounds like we need to shut down or slow industrial civilization because it's driving us to the brink. But slowing or shutting down industrial civilization warms the planet even faster because we lose the aerosols that are produced by industrial activity and that act as something of an umbrella in the upper atmosphere to keep the solar radiation from warming the Earth to begin with. So it's a classic catch-22. If we turn down industrial activity by as little as 20%, according to the latest papers, then that causes a 1 degree Celsius global average temperature rise in a matter of a few weeks. And
Wow.
it could be that the coronavirus has us headed that way. And I suspect that's why the international response to the coronavirus includes attempting to shut down specific areas instead of the whole system at once. I don't know if this is by design or not, and I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but if I was king for a few days, I would say let's shut down industrial activity in China for a few weeks, make everybody stay at home until the coronavirus runs its course far enough so that we can manage the patient load in the hospitals. And then let's shut down someplace else. Let's go to another large economic bloc like the European Union and have everybody stay at home and reduce industrial activity there. And it'll get warm. The aerosols will fall out of the atmosphere over Europe, but it might not be a planet destroying event if we keep moving the areas around in which the industrial activity is shut down using this stay at home approach. I don't know if it'll work. It looks like that's what's happening, whether it's by design or not, I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that it's great because I think that's the only way through the coronavirus situation that also takes into account the aerosol masking effect or global dimming.
Wow. Okay, so we need to end on a brighter note. So if there is a bright note in any of this, go ahead and share it with us, Guy.
Well, in Man's Search for Meaning, Viktor Frankl wrote, first a little preface, Viktor Frankl was a prisoner of war held by the Nazis in Germany during World War II. And he writes in his book, Man's Search for Meaning, which came out right after World War II ended, I think 1946 or 47. And he describes an absolutely horrible situation, obviously. He's there with other prisoners of war. They're getting fed crumbs every day. And here's what he writes in Man's Search for Meaning. Between a stimulus and a response, there is a space. In that space is the power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. The last of human freedoms is to choose one's attitude in any set of circumstances. And I would add, too, that we get to choose our actions in any set of circumstances. So he faced his own personal existential threat every day.
Mm-hmm.
He never knew when he was put into a boxcar whether he would survive, whether at the end of the line he was going to the showers. And yet, he and many of the people who he was with chose to respect the people around them and to act with dignity, even to give up their crumbs so that somebody who is even worse shape could benefit. We're in that kind of world today. I have been for many years been providing the stimulus, the information about abrupt, irreversible climate change. How people respond to that is entirely up to them. Mm-hmm. There's a space between the stimulus and the response, and in that space is the power to choose our response. So in that space between stimulus and response is the power to choose how we're going to act. How are you going to act? Are you going to act as if I'm making the whole thing up and you're going to carry on with your life? Are you going to push your aged grandmother out of the way to get to the last Xbox on the shelf?
Yeah.
So here's what I would propose. Imagine everyone around you is your beloved elderly grandmother. Act like that. Mm-hmm. That's what I propose to people. I'm trying not to tell people what to do.
Right.
But there's always been an existential threat. As Homer pointed out in the Iliad some 2,800 years ago, any moment might be our last.
Yeah, exactly.
And so that's how I live with death over my left shoulder, as if my time is short, because it is.
Well, and I think the coronavirus kind of brings that home. I mean, a few months ago, Christmas time, we were walking around, had no idea what was right around the corner. And I think for me at least, it's really made me take stock of what's really important, what's really not important, and where I need to spend my time focusing. And sometimes maybe some people have called this event a reset button. I don't know, but I agree with you. I think that we can all play our part in some small way, and then that adds up to a big way.
Right. And that's all we've ever had.
Yeah,
Right. You and me and 7.6 billion people on the planet, no, 7.7 billion people on the planet.
yeah,
We've never had a say about the big picture.
right,
We've only ever had our interpersonal interactions with the relatively few people we come into contact with every day.
right, exactly.
Treat them all like your elderly, just about to die grandmother.
Yeah, yeah. All right, Guy. Well, this was a great interview, very informative. I learned a lot. And tell everybody where they can find you and follow you and keep informed of what's going on. Give out all your social media.
Yeah, I post quite regularly on my blog, Nature Bats Last, which you can find at guymcpherson.com. And I think even if you spell McPherson wrong, like you stick an A in there, it'll still be one of the first things that pops up.
Okay, great.
And then I share the information whenever I update, whenever I put an interview like this one or an essay that I write there. I share it on Instagram and Twitter and Faceplant and LinkedIn of all places. So there's a few social media where you can find me.
Perfect. Sounds good. Okay, everybody. Well, thank you for joining me for my return to the podcast chair, and I will have this up on Anchor, and which you'll be able to get on Spotify and I think iTunes, and then I will also upload the visual to YouTube. Again, this is Leanne's Lair. I'm Leanne Moonraven. My guest today was Guy McPherson, and I look forward to seeing you all again very, very soon. Goodbye, everybody.